In this video, I'm going to be looking at the domain of a composite functions. And I'm going to start off with these two functions, f of x equals 1 over x and g of x equals 1 over x minus 3. What if I ask you about the domain of f of x? And what is the meaning of the domain again? The domain means all values of x we can get. So we can get any value of x except 0. Because we couldn't find f of 0, because f of 0 gives us 1 over 0. And 1 over 0, we couldn't find the value of 1 over 0, it's undefined. So in this case, what is the domain? The domain is going to be all real values except 0. So domain for the first function f of x equals are all real values except 0. And what about g of x? What about the domain of the g of x? We can find all values of x except the values which make the denominator 0. So I have here in the denominator, I have x minus 3. So what are the values which make the denominator 0? Okay, the values x, when x equals 3, the denominator will be equal to 0. So the domain for g of x, it's r difference 3, or real values except 3. What if I ask you about, for instance, f of 1? We can find f of 1. f1, it's 1 over 1. And what about g1? g1, we are going to substitute instead of x in the second function, which is g. So g1 equals 1 over 1 minus 3, it's 1 over minus 2. We can find if f of x is 1 over x again, and g of x equals 1 over x minus 3. What if I ask about g2? What is the meaning of g2? To find the value of the function when x equals 2. So it's 1 over 2 minus 3. Okay, it will be 1 over minus 1. What if I ask you about f2? f2, it will be 1 over 2, which is half. Because we have two functions, f of x and g of x. And what if I ask you about f of gx? What is the meaning of that? F of gx. You know, I'm going to put g of x into f of x. So instead of x in the first function, which is f of x, this one, instead of x, any x which is written in the function, any x, we are going to put instead of x 1 over x minus 3. So g of x is going to be the second function f of x. Once again, gx is going to the function f. So it will be 1 over. Instead of x, you are going to write 1 over x minus 3. What about the domain of this function? So firstly, the domain of g of x. What is the domain of g of x? The domain of g of x, it's x minus 3, x minus 3, x difference 3. And what about the domain of f of gx? So to find the domain of f of gx, you will find the domain. So step number 1, find the domain of g of x. Step number 2, find the domain of f of gx. Okay. So what is the domain of g of x? Let's go back to the g of x, which is r difference 3, or real values except 3. And what is the domain of f of g of x? So we have values of x we couldn't find, which is 3 in g of x. And what about f of g of x? Let's simplify it. So multiply by x minus 3 up and down, or we can just write it as 1 divided by 1 over x minus 3, and keep change flip from divide to times, and write x minus 3 over 1. So it will be x minus 3. So f of gx equals x minus 3. And we don't have any restrictions for x. So what is the domain? The domain is r difference 3. Because the domain for this one is r. So the domain for f of g of x, r difference 3. If I have again f of x is 1 over x, and g of x, it's the same as I said, 1 over x minus 3. But in this case, I'm going to ask you about g of f of x. What is the meaning of that? Simply, we are working in gx. So when I ask you about g1, instead of this x, write 1. Instead of this x, write 1. What if I ask about g of 2? g2, instead of this x, write 2. So put your eyes, keep your eye on x, which is written in g of x. What if I ask you about g9? It's 1 over 9 minus 3. So we are going to put the value we need in the function g and write it instead of x. What if I ask you about g of f of x? So in this function, which is 1 over x minus 3, I'm going to write instead of this x the function f of x. And what is the function f of x? It's 1 over x. So I'm going to put the value of the function f of x instead of x here. Okay. So you are going to again put instead of x 1 over in this one. Okay. I'm going to put the value of f of x, which is 1 over x, in that function g of x. Now, so it will be g f of x is going to be 1 over, and instead of this x, I'm going to write 1 over x. Instead of this x, I'll write 1 over x. Okay. So to find the domain of the function g f of x, we are dealing with two functions, and the function f of x is mapped into the function g. So what is the domain of this function f of x, firstly? So the domain of the function f of x, it's x can be any number except 0. So the domain of f of x alone is r difference 0. And what about the domain of g of f of x? So you should find the domain of f of x, the original first function. This is the original first function. And find the domain of g of f of x. Okay, so let's simplify it by multiplying by x up and down. So multiply by x and multiply by x. So 1 times x, it's x, and down we have x times 1 over x, which is 1, minus 3x. What is the domain of this function? To find the domain of this function, it will be all values of x. We can find any value for x except 1 over 3, except 1/3. So the domain d2 equals our difference 1 over 3. So what are all restrictions for x? We have our difference 0, and we have our difference 1 over 3. So the domain of g f of x, the domain of g f of x is going to be our difference 0 and 1 over 3. Why is that? Because we couldn't find 0 in the original first function, which is f of x. This is the original first function. This one is the original first function. And we couldn't find the value of 1/3 in the function g f of x. See you in the coming episodes. Goodbye.